The synthesis matrix was a coffin standing on its end. That was Dika's first thought when she descended into the engineering sublevel 18 hours ago, and it was still her thought now. The machine occupied the center of the compartment like a monument to itself, 2.5 meters tall, matte gray, every visible surface covered in combine notation that she couldn't read but was learning to feel. The dispensing tray jutted from its midsection at waist height, a slot roughly the size and charm of a mail drop. Above it, a configurator interface spread across a panel the width of her shoulders, rows of symbols, sliders, input fields, all in that blocky combine script that looked like someone had tried to invent an alphabet using only right angles. She'd been standing in front of it so long, her lower back had developed its own heartbeat. The captain's explanation, delivered through Aisha's halting translation 2 watches ago, had been simple. The matrix converts base feedstock into nutritional output. The feedstock is stored in a sealed reservoir beneath the deck. The output parameters determine what comes out. Currently, the output parameters are set to slab, which the captain described using a combine word that Aisha rendered as sufficient sustenance unit. Sufficient. Dika turned that word over. 600 people eating sufficient sustenance units 3 times a day for 8 days. She'd seen what sufficient looked like in the feeding bay. Gray-brown rectangles with the texture of compressed sawdust. A faint chemical sweetness that wasn't sweet enough to be food and wasn't absent enough to be nothing. People ate them the way she'd seen people eat emergency rations in Dadaab. Mechanically, eyes elsewhere. The act of chewing reduced to a body function rather than an experience. The difference between surviving and living was, frequently, a meal. She leaned closer to the configurator panel. 18 hours had given her enough to map the interface's architecture, if not its language. The slab setting used 3 parameters. 3. Out of, she counted again, running her finger along the rows, 47 available input fields. Semi. Somebody had built a machine with 47 degrees of freedom and then locked 44 of them. The fields were grayed out in the interface, but physically present in the panel's layout, and when she'd pried the panel side cover off 6 hours ago, the connectors behind each locked field were identical to the connectors behind the 3 active ones. The Combine built this machine to do exactly what they needed it to do and no more, she thought, pressing her thumb against one of the grayed-out sliders. It didn't move. That's usually a trap. Right now it's a gift. If they'd built it properly, I'd have no idea how to get inside it. Because the lock wasn't cryptographic, wasn't mechanical, it was administrative. Someone with configurator access had set the 44 fields to default values and then flagged them as non-adjustable. The flag was a single symbol in the field header, the same symbol on every locked field. Deka didn't know what the symbol meant. She didn't need to. She'd already found it in the panel's physical wiring, a bypass loop that routed each flagged field's input away from the processing core and into a dead register. Snip the loop, the field becomes live. If she'd snipped the first 340 minutes ago using a sharpened edge from a broken deck plate, her fingers still smelled like ozone where the insulation had scorched. The 3 fields she'd unlocked were, she was fairly sure, related to output density, chemical composition ratio, and something she couldn't identify but suspected was texture. She derived this from first principles. The 3 active slab parameters controlled volume, dispensing rate, and what she thought of as repeat cycle. The unlocked field sat adjacent in the physical layout, which in every engineering architecture she'd ever encountered meant they governed related functions. Fairly sure, suspected, thought of as, she was about to feed 600 people based on educated guesses and the spatial logic of an alien machine she'd known for 18 hours. Deka pulled her stylus, a repurposed probe from the captain's bridge kit with a tip narrow enough to interact with the Combine touch input, and tapped the first unlocked field. Something on the display changed. She couldn't read it, but the machine hummed differently. "All right," she said aloud, because the engineering sublevel was empty, and sometimes the sound of her own voice was the only thing that confirmed she was awake. "Let's see what you can do." She set the unlocked density field high, the composition field to what she hoped was a midpoint, and the texture field to, honestly, random, because she had no baseline. Then she initiated a dispensing cycle. The matrix hummed. The hum rose in pitch, which was new. The dispensing slot produced a sound like a very dignified belch. What emerged onto the tray was a rectangle approximately the size and shape of a standard nutrient slab, but the color of sidewalk chalk and the consistency of wet putty. It was chalk white, faintly luminous, and it smelled like electrical fire and old pennies. Ducka picked it up. It was warm. It had weight. It was, technically, a thing that the machine had produced in response to her inputs. She bit the corner. Her tongue delivered its report. Mineral, acrid, with a lingering aftertaste of ionized copper that sat in the back of her throat like a warning. Though, improbably, her stomach didn't reject it outright, which by the standards of her first week on the ship qualified as a passing grade. Worth eating? She set it back on the tray. Her face was specific. Recalibration, not disgust. She'd eaten worse in worse places. The density was too high, the composition was wrong in a direction she could feel but couldn't name, and the texture setting had apparently meant chalk. She'd need to adjust all three and figure out which direction each parameter moved the output. She was going to need more attempts. He was going to need Aisha. The Romani woman arrived 2 hours later with vocabulary lists inked on her forearm in the Combine's angular script. Because paper didn't exist on the ship and skin was the most portable writing surface she had. "You've been busy," Isha said, looking at the engineering sublevel. Dika had rearranged the space since her last visit. The panel cover was off, the bypass wiring visible, and 3 failed output slabs were lined up on the dispensing tray like evidence at an inquest. I unlocked 44 additional parameters. The Nozak Ahatish raised both eyebrows. 44? The slab setting uses 3. The machine has 47. Somebody locked the rest. Deliberately. Administratively. Datika gestured at the grayed out fields on the panel. Same lockout flag on every one. I've opened 3 so far. The first attempt, she pointed at the chalk white rectangle. Don't eat that one. Aishi picked it up, sniffed it, and set it down with the careful precision of someone who has handled worse but sees no reason to prove it. I have the interface words, she said, turning her forearm so Decca could see the inked list. 41 Combine words I've confirmed from the PA system, the captain's explanations, and the freed species. 11 of those appear on this panel. Show me. Ajisha stepped to the configurator. Her finger moved across the field headers, pausing at each one she recognized. This one is quantity, the same root as the cargo manifest number. This one is cycle, I think, as in repetition. This, she frowned, turning her arm to compare. This is texture, but the Combine word carries a secondary meaning. Resistance, how much the thing pushes back against the mouth, against processing. Mouthfeel, Dika said. I don't know that word. How a food feels when you chew it. It's, never mind, it's perfect. That's the texture parameter. What about this one? She pointed at the composition field she'd unlocked. She studied it, checked her arm, studied it again. This is 2 words compressed into 1 symbol. The first is balance, ratio, proportion. The second is, it could be life, or energy, or metabolic function. The captain used it when he described the feedstock conversion, nutritional balance. Deka was already adjusting her mental model. So the 3 I unlocked are density, nutritional balance, and mouthfeel. That's a start. She picked up her stylus. Help me with the others? They worked side by side for the next hour. Aisha's vocabulary list was a key that fit some locks and not others. Of the 47 total parameters, she could identify 19 by cross-referencing Combine roots she knew with the field labels. Some were obvious once named: temperature, moisture content, dispensing shape. Others were opaque. One field Aisha translated as memory, which could mean anything from shelf life to data logging, to something neither of them had a framework for. But 19 identified parameters out of 47 was enough to try again. Attempt 2, Deka said, adjusting density down, nutritional balance toward what she hoped was a human-compatible midpoint, and mouthfeel away from chalk and toward, she guessed, less chalk. The matrix hummed, the slot dispensed. What came out was brown this time, roughly the right color for something that could claim kinship with food, and when Deka pressed it between her fingers, the texture yielded. Progress. She broke it in half, handed one piece to Aisha. They bit simultaneously. Better, measurably better. The texture landed between bread and compressed grain. Wrong, but in the neighborhood of right. The problem was the taste, which swung wildly between sour and sweet in a way that suggested the nutritional balance parameter didn't work the way she'd assumed. Her tongue kept trying to categorize what it was receiving and failing, because the chemical signature of the output was fighting with itself. Wrong balance, Deka said, chewing thoughtfully. But the texture is close. Aishana swallowed her piece without complaint, which Deka had learned was the Romani woman's version of a positive review. Closer than the chalk, the balance parameter isn't a simple slider. It's controlling multiple nutritional components at once, proteins, sugars, fats, whatever the combined equivalent categories are, and moving it in one direction skews everything. I need to find the subparameters. There may not be subparameters. The combine may not separate them. Deka looked at the 47 fields, looked at the 19 Aja had identified, looked at the 28 unknowns. Then I'll separate them myself, she said. The third attempt took them another hour and a half of iterative adjustments. Aja identified 2 more parameter fields. One she translated as acid or sharpness, the other as weight in a nutritional rather than physical sense. Deka tweaked the balance field back toward neutral and used the new acid and weight parameters to compensate. The matrix hummed, dispensed, and produced something that was, by every measurable criterion, food. It was brown. It had the texture of dense bread. It held together when you picked it up. It smelled like nothing objectionable. The nutritional indicator on the dispensing tray, a light that Deka had finally figured out, was a quality readout, glowed the steady amber that meant within acceptable parameters. When Deka bit into it, she chewed, she set it down. It tastes like nothing, she said. Technically correct nothing, Feu. Azia took her piece, ate it, considered. That is still progress. In my experience, technically correct nothing is 3 steps from something. 3 steps. I have been making something out of technically correct nothing my whole life, Deka. The warmth in Azia's voice was earned. She was sharing a credential, not offering comfort. The trick is always the same. You learn what the machine can do. Then you learn what it won't do. Then you do the thing in between. Deka almost smiled. Almost. I'll take another pass. But first I want to look at the dispensing logs. The synthesis matrix kept logs. Deka had noticed the logging function 6 hours into her first session, a data field at the bottom of the configurator panel that she'd initially dismissed as a status readout. It was an archive. Every dispensing cycle the matrix had ever run was recorded, timestamp, parameter settings, output quantity, feedstock consumption, and this was the part that stopped her, a field Aisha had translated as purpose designator. The cargo slabs, the gray-brown rectangles they'd been eating for 8 days, were logged under a purpose designator that Aisha rendered as sustenance, tokens made as sustenance to say it's detend anixa seal. Deka had scrolled back through the log entries. Every single slab dispensed since they'd been brought aboard carried the same designator. She had scrolled further, older entries from before their harvest, presumably for previous cargo, carried the same designator with minor parameter variations. She scrolled further still. The log went back years, decades. The matrix had been running the same basic output parameters, with minor adjustments for species-specific tolerances, for longer than she'd been alive. And every entry, without exception, carried a calibration code. Dika didn't know what the calibration code meant. It was a string of combine symbols appended to each log entry, consistent, standardized, clearly referencing something outside the synthesis system itself. She'd initially assumed it was a quality control reference, a batch number, a maintenance tag. It wasn't. Aisha had identified the first symbol in the string, behavior, and the second, compliance, and the third, which took her 20 minutes of cross-referencing and left her very quiet when she was done, optimal. The calibration code linked each slab's nutritional output to a behavioral compliance metric. Deka opened the code's referenced file. It was a table, 2 columns. The left column listed metabolic output values, caloric content, protein ratio, micronutrient density, in precise combine units that she couldn't convert but could compare. The right column listed behavioral indicators, also in combine shorthand, but the structure was unmistakable: frequency of movement, vocalization rates, sleep cycles, resistance events. The table showed a clear correlation. As metabolic output decreased, resistance events decreased. The slab parameters weren't set to the metabolic minimum. Dika could see the minimum. The table listed it as a floor value, a baseline below which the combine's own documentation flagged output as insufficient for cargo viability. The slab parameters were set above that floor, 80% above, specifically, consistently, precisely 80% of metabolic minimum. The cargo didn't starve, didn't sicken visibly, didn't become unviable for sale, and stayed just far enough below full metabolic function that everything, moving, thinking, fighting, planning, hoping, was a little harder than it needed to be. Dika sat with this for a long time. The engineering sub-level was very quiet. The matrix hummed its standby hum. The 3 failed slabs sat on the dispensing tray, evidence of her 18 hours of work. Above her, somewhere in the ship's middle decks, 600 people were eating 80% slabs and wondering why their bodies felt heavy and their thoughts came slow, and the corridor walks they took between feedings left them winded. He thought about the burned man whose arms had been mapped with electrical scars from the ship's containment systems. He thought about the incapacitated captives they'd found in the holding bay, barely conscious, too weak to stand. He thought about the children. There were children aboard. She'd seen them in the feeding rotation, eating rectangles of calibrated insufficiency 3 times a day, while their growing bodies ran 20% short of what they needed. This was calibration. This was a parameter setting. Someone, some combine technician, maybe centuries ago, had found the correlation between metabolic suppression and resistance reduction, and had set the synthesis matrix accordingly, and had failed the documentation, and the documentation had been replicated across every harvest ship in the fleet, and no one had reviewed it since because it worked. It worked. Dika stood up. She found Aisha in the corridor outside the sub-level, where the Romani woman had been sitting on a junction cover, reviewing her vocabulary lists. They were running it at 80%, Dika said. The slabs, to keep us slow. Cost doesn't matter to a machine. Her voice was flat. The flatness was anger. Aisha looked up, her dark eyes moved across Dika's face, reading the terrain of it the way she read every room she entered, for threat, for need, for what was unspoken. Show me, Aisha said. Dika showed her the log, the calibration code, the behavioral compliance table, the 80% line. Aisha read it all without speaking, her inked forearm pressed against the edge of the panel, her lips moving slightly as she translated the combine symbols she knew and inferred the ones she didn't. When she was done, she straightened. Her expression was complex in a way Dika was still learning to read, older and more settled than shock or outrage. I have known about deliberate suppression my whole life, Aisha said quietly. I did not need to learn it from a log file. She paused. But you did, and watching you learn it is its own kind of useful. Dika understood. She understood it the way she understood structural engineering. The information itself was not the payload. The payload was what you did with it. Aisha had survived suppression, survived being made deliberately less, deliberately slower, deliberately smaller, since before the combine existed. She carried that knowledge in her bones, in her family's memory, in the way she read every room she entered for the exit. For Dika, daughter of a world that had named these things, cataloged them, built international frameworks to condemn them, the log file was new, and the fact it described was not. I'm going to fix it, Dika said. I know, right now, before the next feeding rotation. I know that too. Dika turned back to the synthesis matrix. The fourth attempt was not elegant. She'd been awake for 20 hours. Her hands had a fine tremor that she was managing by pressing her wrists against the panel edge. The anger from the suppression log had settled into stubbornness, denser, colder, with better structural integrity. The stubbornness of a woman who had learned at 18 to repair field generators in places where the supply chain was a fiction and the spare parts were whatever you could fabricate from what the last team left behind. He set the metabolic output to 100%, full caloric density, full protein, full micronutrient spectrum. The Combine's own documentation told her what the values should be. The floor was listed, the optimal was implied by the behavioral table, and the difference was a gap she could calculate even in Combine units. Then she went back to the texture and taste parameters. Aisha sat beside her, no longer translating but present. Occasionally she'd point at a field label and say a word, sometimes the Combine word, sometimes a word in her own language that Decca didn't understand, but which carried enough inflection to communicate yes, that one, or careful, that's different than you think. Decca adjusted the acid parameter down, the weight parameter up, the mouthfeel parameter to a setting she'd derived from the 3 failed attempts, a point she'd mapped on her mental model as dense enough to feel real, soft enough to not fight you. She adjusted 3 more parameters she'd unlocked in the last hour. One Aisha had identified as aroma, one as color, and one whose label neither of them could translate, but whose position in the physical layout sat between taste and texture, and which Decca decided to call warmth until someone told her otherwise. She set warmth to high. Dispensing, she said. The matrix hummed. The hum was different again, fuller, more sustained, with a harmonic undertone she hadn't heard before. The machine was working harder, using more of itself. The feedstock reservoir under the deck vibrated faintly through the floor. The dispensing slot produced the 4th attempt. It was small, deliberately. She'd kept the volume conservative. It was brown, a warm brown, darker than the slabs. It held its shape on the tray. When Dika picked it up, it was warm in her hand, genuinely warm, and the warmth carried an aroma that was close to food. Grain adjacent, something in the neighborhood of toasted grain, or heated starch, or the smell of a kitchen where someone was cooking something simple that required patience. She broke it in half. The interior was slightly lighter than the exterior. It yielded like bread that hadn't quite risen. It wasn't bread, it wasn't anything she could name, but it was warm, and it smelled like something a person had made, and when she bit into it, the taste was there. Not good, not familiar, not correct in any way she could map to a cuisine or a memory or a tradition, but present. The 3rd attempt had tasted like nothing, technically correct nothing, she'd said, and meant it. The 4th attempt tasted like something, a simple, plain, warm something, with grain-adjacent density and a faint nuttiness that might have been the protein component expressing itself, and a finish that lingered just long enough to register on her tongue before fading. It was imperfect, clearly wrong in ways she could enumerate, 9 things from taste alone, and she suspected the nutritional profile was still uneven in ways she'd need more iterations to fix. But it was warm, and it was real, and it was 100% of metabolic minimum, which meant that every person who ate it would be, for the first time since they'd been brought aboard this ship, fully fed. She handed the other half to Aisha. Aisha ate it slowly, her eyes closed for a moment. She didn't speak. It's not right, Deka said. No, it's not done. No, but it's you make it a seat it's enough to start with. Deka reached for the dispensing controls and initiated a full batch cycle, setting the output to 600 portions at the volume that matched the standard feeding rotation. Kivizam sustained, committed, and began to produce. The first batch went to the feeding bay 40 minutes later. Deka didn't go herself. She sent the portions through the distribution conveyor and stayed at the matrix watching the feedstock reservoir levels and the output quality indicator because she was an engineer and the machine was running a new configuration for the first time and someone needed to watch it in case it seized or surged or decided that 47 parameters were too many to manage and defaulted back to slabs. Aisha went. Aisha was always the bridge. 20 minutes later, Aisha returned. She stood in the sub-level doorway, and her face carried something Deka had learned to read as the news is small but the news is good. One of the group, I don't know which era, she doesn't share any of my words. She ate it. All of it. And then she said one word. What word? I don't know her language, but I've heard that word before, in a different context. The freed species use a cognate when they describe something that meets a need without exceeding it. What does it mean? Aish paused. Considered. Enough. Deka exhaled. She was still standing at the synthesis matrix, her hands on the panel edge, the feedstock reservoir humming under the deck. She was exhausted and angry, and the anger had been useful, and the exhaustion was starting to win. Her eyes burned. The river back had given up having its own heartbeat and settled for a steady ache. Someone had eaten the thing she'd made and said enough. That was the bar. They'd hit it. She allowed herself 4 minutes. 4 minutes of standing still with her eyes closed, feeling the matrix hum through her palms, before she sealed the panel, collected her stylus, and climbed the ladder to the corridor level. The bridge was 2 decks up. She could have slept. 20 hours was 20 hours, and her body knew it, but the suppression log was still in her head, and the number 0.80 was still behind her eyes, and sleep was not going to happen until she told someone else about it. Someone who would understand the engineering implications. The bridge was quiet. Third watch, the broad-shouldered woman with the close-cropped hair, Pakle. Deka reminded herself. She'd learned the name 4 days ago, and it had stuck because of the way the woman wore it, spare and directional, was at the navigation station, doing what she always did, reading the star chart like it was land. Deka crossed to the engineering console, pulled up the navigation overlay, looked at the recovery team's intercept heading that Pakla had been tracking since they changed course toward the avoided cluster. The heading had changed. They adjusted again, Pakla said, without looking up. When? This watch. 6 hours ago, then again 2 hours ago. Tighter each time. Pakla's finger traced the 2 most recent trajectory lines on the display. They converged on the Arvith's projected position like lines of sight narrowing on a target. They're faster than we are. They get lit the navigation display. The trajectories were clear. The recovery team was closing the gap, barely visible in any single hour, undeniable over days, the way a current erodes a bank. Then she looked at the engineering display, the power distribution schematic, the drive output versus the mass the drives were pushing, the load balance, how the ship's internal weight was distributed across its structural frame. Then she looked back at the navigation display. The ship is holding back, she said. Pakla turned, not deliberately, but whoever designed the cargo hold configuration distributed the mass wrong. All the weight is aft, the cells, the feedstock reservoir, the containment systems. The drives compensate, but compensation costs power. We're spending 20% of our drive output just fighting our own mass distribution. She could see it now, clear as a wiring diagram. The Combine had designed the ship to carry cargo that didn't want to be carried, and they'd put the cargo as far from the bridge as possible, and they'd put the containment systems next to the cargo, and they'd put the feedstock next to the containment systems, and the cumulative result was a ship that flew like it was dragging an anchor because its architects had optimized for control rather than speed. We could be 20% faster, Decca said, with a different load balance. Pakla looked at the recovery team's trajectory, looked at Decca. The Comanche woman's expression was the one Decca had learned to read as "tell me more." I need to redistribute the mass, move the feedstock forward, shift the containment weight, rebalance the structural load across the frame. It's not a small job, but the ship was built for slave labor to operate, which means the cargo systems are modular, which means they can be moved. She was already running the calculations in her head, matching what she knew of the drive system against what she'd learned of the structural frame during her 18 hours in the sub-level. Give me 2 days and 30 people who can lift. Pakla looked at the star chart, looked at the closing trajectories, looked at the 2 days of margin they might or might not have. She nodded once. Decca marked the synthesis problem as solved for now, failed the suppression log in the part of her mind where she kept things that would fuel her for a very long time, and began sketching a mass redistribution plan on the engineering console. The R Zone 1 slower than it needed to be, not for much longer.